As you settle into a place of rest, let us journey together into the life and legacy of one of history's most luminous figures, Dante Alighieri, and his monumental work, The Divine Comedy. In the gentle stillness of this narration, we will slowly unfold the tale of a poet whose words bridged the medieval and modern worlds, whose imagination conjured vistas of heaven and hell, and whose verse continues to whisper across the centuries. Tonight, we will drift with him along the roads of Florence, across the landscapes of Exile, and through the intricate paths of his epic poem. Dante Alighieri was born in Florence in 1265 into a time of political division, spiritual fervor, and cultural transformation. The city itself, nestled in Tuscany, was already flourishing as a hub of trade, art, and intellectual life. Yet Florence was no peaceful haven. The rival factions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines, the former loyal to the papacy, the latter aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor, divided its streets and households. Dante's early years were marked by these divisions, and his adult life would be profoundly shaped by their consequences. He was destined to become both a poet of Florence and an exile from Florence, bound to his homeland, yet forever separated from it. But before we wander too far ahead, let us rest in the world he inhabited. The 13th century was a moment in Europe when medieval thought flourished alongside the beginnings of Renaissance humanism. Universities spread across the continent, cathedral spires rose into the skies, and chivalric poetry filled courts and gatherings. Dante absorbed this world with a quiet intensity. He was schooled in the trivium and quadrivium, the medieval curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and thus gained not only the tools of expression, but also the frameworks of philosophy and theology that would later give the Divine Comedy its distinctive texture. Among the most decisive moments of his early life was his encounter with Beatrice Portinari, the young woman whom Dante first saw in childhood and who would later become the guiding inspiration of his poetry. Although their personal interactions were limited, Beatrice assumed an exalted role in Dante's imagination. She became not merely a beloved figure, but a symbol of divine love and a vehicle for salvation. When she died in 1290, Dante's grief gave birth to a lifetime of poetic reflection, culminating in her appearance as his celestial guide in the Divine Comedy. Dante's personal life unfolded within the turbulent politics of Florence. As a member of the White Guelphs, a faction seeking independence from both papal interference and imperial domination, Dante was deeply involved in civic matters. He held offices, delivered speeches, and engaged in the civic debates of his time. Yet political fortunes shifted quickly, and in 1302, when the rival Black Guelph seized control of Florence with papal support, Dante was condemned to exile. Stripped of his property and sentenced to death should he return, Dante became a wanderer across Italy, moving from court to court, city to city. It was during this long period of exile, with Florence forever out of reach, that he composed his magnum opus. The Divine Comedy is not simply a poem, it is a vast vision of the human soul's journey toward God. Written in vernacular Italian rather than Latin, it opened the world of learning and spirituality to ordinary readers, securing Dante's place as the father of the Italian language. Structured in 3 canticles, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, the work guides its audience through realms of the afterlife, encountering sinners, penitents, saints, and ultimately the vision of the divine. Each section reveals not only Dante's theological and philosophical convictions, but also his lived experience, his grief, his longing, his anger at injustice, and his hope for redemption. As we prepare to traverse this journey in depth, it is worth noting how Dante's poem is both deeply medieval and profoundly timeless. The medieval worldview is present in the precise ordering of the cosmos, the hierarchical vision of sin and virtue, and the intricate weaving of classical learning with Christian doctrine. Yet at the same time, there is a universality to Dante's questions. What is justice? What is love? How does one live a meaningful life in a world of corruption and loss? These are questions that echo in every age, which is why Dante remains a companion to readers even 7 centuries after his death. In exploring the history of Dante and the Divine Comedy, we will move step by step. We will begin with the Florence of Dante's youth, then trace his education, his political involvement, and his eventual exile. We will pause to dwell on his poetic innovations, his philosophical influences, and the creation of the comedy. We will walk alongside him through the imagined landscapes of hell, purgatory, and heaven, and finally consider the legacy of his work, how it inspired generations of artists, theologians, and thinkers, and how it continues to shape our imagination of the afterlife today. This journey, like Dante's, is not one of haste, but of careful observation. As we pass through each stage, let us listen to the quiet details. The sounds of Florentine streets, the rhythm of medieval verse, the flicker of candles in monasteries where Dante may have studied, the hush of exiled footsteps on unfamiliar roads. These details, woven gently together, allow us to feel the centuries not as distant echoes, but as a continuous presence. So now, with calm attention, let us begin. We will let the centuries unfold, the story expand, and the voice of Dante rise softly once more. His life, his exile, and his poetry await us, ready to be explored in depth. Tonight, as we drift through time, we fall asleep to the entire history of Dante and the Divine Comedy. Florence in the 13th century is alive with sound, color, and contradiction. The city lies nestled in the Tuscan valley, surrounded by rolling hills lined with olive groves and vineyards, and yet within its walls, tensions ripple through the streets. This is the city into which Dante Alighieri is born in 1265. From the moment of his arrival, Florence shapes him in ways both nurturing and cruel. It is a place of culture, learning, and devotion, but also a place divided by political rivalry and violent unrest. To understand Dante, we must first imagine this Florence. Merchants crowd the busy markets near the Ponte Vecchio, offering silks, wool, and spices that arrive from distant lands through intricate trade routes. The clang of blacksmiths mixes with the calls of vendors while pilgrims pass through, carrying tales of holy shrines. Amid this hum of activity stands a city devoted to grandeur. The construction of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore has begun, its foundations promising a dome that will one day crown Florence as a jewel of Christendom. Towers rise above narrow streets, each family vying to display wealth and power. Beneath this surface of prosperity, however, lies a constant current of rivalry, for Florence is torn between factions, each claiming loyalty to a different vision of authority. These rivalries are the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs, aligned with the papacy, and the Ghibellines, loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, divide Florence into two camps. For years, battles flare within the city walls and across Tuscany's hillsides. Families align themselves with one side or another, and victories are often short-lived. Dante's own family is of Guelph leaning, though not of great wealth or prominence. His upbringing is shaped not only by the cultural wealth of Florence, but also by the instability created by shifting power. Even in his youth, Dante senses that political fortunes are fragile and that exile or ruin can fall upon even the most established households. While the city's politics are turbulent, its culture is radiant. Florence at this time is one of the most dynamic centers of medieval Italy. Banking families accumulate wealth through trade networks that stretch into France and beyond. With prosperity comes patronage of the arts. The Tuscan dialect is increasingly used in poetry, breaking away from the dominance of Latin, and the seeds of Italian literature are taking root. Dante will grow to become a central figure in this movement, but in his youth, he is still a boy, observing, listening, absorbing. Daily life for the young Dante is filled with the rhythms of medieval Florence. Streets are narrow, paved with stone, lined with tall houses designed for both residence and defense. Families are tightly knit, and kinship defines one's opportunities and limits. Religion permeates existence. Churches stand at the center of neighborhoods, their bells marking the hours of prayer, their altars filled with candles and painted icons. Festivals punctuate the year. Easter with its solemn processions and feast days with music and games. Even in ordinary times, the cycle of life is marked by sacraments, baptism, marriage, confession, reminding citizens of their place in a spiritual order. It is in this world that Dante begins to learn. Formal education in Florence is limited to those families who can afford it, and Dante's family, though not wealthy, ensures he receives a solid grounding. He studies grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the pillars of the medieval trivium, providing him with skills in reading and persuasion. Later, he expands into the quadrivium, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, offering him a sense of harmony and proportion that will echo in his poetry. Yet Dante's education is not confined to classrooms. Florence itself is a school, its streets alive with poetry recited in gatherings, with sermons delivered in churches, and with debates shouted in public squares. One of the defining features of Florence is its connection to both tradition and innovation. Guilds regulate trades, maintaining order among artisans, but they also promote new learning and sponsor civic works. Writers experiment with verse forms, drawing upon Provençal troubadour traditions and adapting them into the Tuscan vernacular. This is the environment that nurtures Dante's early interests, where he first encounters poetry as a living force, something shared, performed, and celebrated within the community. At the same time, Florence is also a city of limits. Its violence, its rigid divisions, and its demand for loyalty to faction and family foreshadow the trials Dante will later endure. Exile is a constant threat for those on the wrong side of power. Executions and banishments are common, carried out swiftly by victorious factions. Dante grows up knowing that civic identity is precarious, that fortunes shift with political winds, and that loyalty can lead to ruin. This awareness deepens his sensitivity to justice, betrayal, and destiny, themes that will one day shape the Divine Comedy. Even as a boy, Dante would have seen the grandeur of public festivals. On feast days, Florence transforms. Streets are adorned with banners, families gather for parades, and poetry and song echo into the evening. Such experiences leave lasting impressions, binding the spiritual and the artistic together. Dante begins to sense that beauty itself can point toward the divine, and that art and faith are not separate pursuits, but intertwined paths. When we picture Dante's childhood, we imagine a boy walking along Florence's Arno River, gazing at bridges filled with merchants, hearing debates spill from guild halls, and pausing before churches where frescoes glow with color. His world is vibrant, but it is also fragile. Behind each corner lies the potential for conflict. This dual nature of Florence, rich in culture, torn by strife, becomes a mirror for Dante's own life. Florence gives him his language, his education, his first inspirations, and yet it will also cast him into exile, denying him a return. As we rest on this early chapter, we see how Florence is not merely the setting for Dante's beginnings, but the soil in which his roots are planted. Its contradictions become his contradictions, its beauty his inspiration, its strife his wound. In Florence, Dante learns the lessons of faith, art, and community, but also the lessons of betrayal and instability. These will become threads woven throughout his life and magnified in his poetry. As we drift further into his story, we carry with us the sounds and images of medieval Florence. The bells tolling, the banners flying, the marketplace alive with voices. It is here, in this world of promise and peril, that Dante's journey begins. Education in the medieval world is both structured and fluid, formal and experiential. For Dante, Florence itself is a classroom, but his path through the more formal avenues of learning also leaves lasting marks on his mind and style. To understand the emergence of Dante as a poet, we must pause with him in the lecture halls, the cloisters, and the gatherings where words are weighed as carefully as gold. Dante begins with the trivium, the first three subjects of medieval education: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar, in this context, is not simply the mechanics of language, but the study of Latin, the key to the intellectual heritage of Rome. Latin texts, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, are central to this training. Rhetoric follows, teaching persuasion and the ability to craft language with elegance, while logic fosters clarity and structure of thought. These three disciplines provide the foundation for every medieval scholar, equipping Dante with the ability to engage in debate, compose verse, and think with precision. As Dante advances, he touches upon the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Arithmetic and geometry train the mind in patterns and proportion. Music offers insight into harmony and order, and astronomy reveals the movements of the heavens. Astronomy in Dante's day is more than science. It is a way of seeing divine order in the stars and planets. These studies are not abstract. They resonate deeply with Dante's future poetry. The careful structure of the Divine Comedy, with its numerological patterns, reflects the quadrivium's emphasis on order and symmetry. Dante's education is not confined to Florence. Scholars of the time frequently traveled between centers of learning. Bologna, for example, hosts one of Europe's great universities, renowned for its studies in law. Though evidence is fragmentary, Dante likely spent time there, expanding his learning beyond Florence. He also immerses himself in philosophy, particularly through the works of Aristotle, whose rediscovery in the Middle Ages profoundly shapes European thought. Aristotle reaches Dante through Latin translations and commentaries by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. The union of reason and faith, what Aquinas calls scholastic theology, deeply influences Dante, giving him a framework that unites intellect with spirituality. Alongside formal learning, Dante also absorbs the vibrant world of poetry flourishing in Italy. The Stilnovisti, or poets of the sweet new style, are experimenting with themes of love, spirituality, and the elevation of the beloved into a figure of transcendence. Guido Guinizelli is often regarded as the forerunner of this movement, and Guido Cavalcanti, a contemporary and friend of Dante, becomes an important companion in poetic exploration. Their verses treat love not merely as passion, but as a force that refines the soul and points toward higher truth. Dante embraces this style and contributes to its evolution, blending personal feeling with philosophical depth. It is during this time that Dante begins to compose his earliest known works. Among them is the Vita Nuova, or New Life, a collection of poems and prose reflections centered around Beatrice. Written in the vernacular Tuscan rather than Latin, it represents a bold choice. Dante is aligning himself with a growing movement to elevate the local tongue into a literary language, accessible not just to scholars, but to the people. His decision would eventually shape the development of modern Italian itself. In the Vita Nuova, Dante reflects on love, grief, and the transformative power of Beatrice, weaving together verse and commentary in a style that anticipates the fusion of poetry and philosophy that will characterize the Divine Comedy. Yet education is not only about texts and verse. It is about the conversations Dante has with fellow poets, the sermons he hears in Florence's churches, and the daily exposure to the intellectual ferment of his age. Florence, Bologna, and beyond offer him contact with multiple traditions, classical, Christian, and vernacular. He absorbs the grandeur of Virgil's Aeneid, the theology of Aquinas, the poetry of his contemporaries, and the folk traditions of Tuscan song. All these streams converge within him, forming a unique voice that can speak both with the authority of learning and the intimacy of lived emotion. As Dante develops as a poet, he shows signs of a distinctive vision, his use of allegory. Allegory is a way of telling a story on two levels at once. On the surface, a narrative unfolds, but beneath it lies a deeper meaning, whether moral, spiritual, or philosophical. Medieval readers are accustomed to allegory in scripture and literature, but Dante will elevate it to new heights, using it as the very structure of his great work. Even in his early poetry, allegorical currents appear, where Beatrice is not only a woman, but also a symbol of divine grace. Daily rhythms continue to shape his intellectual journey. By day, Florence hums with trade and debate. By night, gatherings of poets share their verses. In this atmosphere, Dante learns not only to write, but also to listen, to refine his language through dialogue, to shape his art in the crucible of exchange. He is both student and participant, apprentice and innovator. It is worth reflecting on how Dante's early education becomes the seedbed of his later genius. Without grammar, he could not wield language with precision. Without rhetoric, he could not persuade and inspire. Without logic, his work would lack coherence. Without music, his verse would not sing. Without astronomy, he would not frame the cosmos of the comedy. And without the vernacular poetry of his peers, he would not find the courage to elevate Italian to the heights of epic expression. Each element contributes, like stones carefully set into a cathedral, forming the structure of his future work. As we rest on this stage of his journey, we see Dante emerging not only as a poet, but as a man of synthesis. He is gathering strands from multiple traditions and weaving them into a fabric that is uniquely his own. He is preparing, though he does not yet know it, for a journey through the vast realms of imagination, where all these disciplines, grammar, philosophy, poetry, theology, will come together in one vision. As you drift into stillness, imagine Dante as a young man, seated at a desk with a candle flickering nearby, parchment spread before him, pen in hand. Around him echo the voices of poets, philosophers, and theologians, all becoming companions in his mind. This is the Dante we leave here. A student, a poet in formation, a soul gathering strength for the epic path that lies ahead. Love in the world of Dante is not merely an emotion. It is a cosmic force, a guiding principle that shapes destiny and points toward the divine. At the heart of Dante's poetic and spiritual imagination stands Beatrice Portinari, the woman he first encounters as a child, who later becomes the inspiration for his earliest poetry and ultimately the radiant guide in the Divine Comedy. To understand Dante's vision of love, we must pause to linger on Beatrice, her presence in his life, and the literary culture of courtly love that gives form to his devotion. The story begins in Florence in 1274, when Dante is around 9 years old. He sees Beatrice for the first time, a girl of the same age, dressed in a soft crimson gown. The encounter is brief, but for Dante, it imprints itself upon his memory with the force of revelation. In his later recollections, he describes this first meeting as transformative, a moment when the stirrings of love awaken not only affection, but also a sense of spiritual awakening. Unlike many medieval tales of courtly love, which revolve around flirtation or distant longing, Dante's vision is infused from the beginning with a sense of sacred significance. The two cross paths again 9 years later. Beatrice greets him, and in that simple gesture, Dante feels blessed, as though touched by grace itself. Yet their personal interactions remain minimal. Beatrice is married to another man, as was common in arranged Florentine marriages, and Dante himself is later married to Gemma Donati. Despite these circumstances, Beatrice occupies a central place in Dante's inner life, not as a conventional beloved, but as an emblem of beauty, virtue, and divine order. When she dies young in 1290, Dante is overwhelmed with grief, and it is this grief that fuels his poetry, giving it a depth of longing and transcendence. It is within this context that Dante composes the Vita Nuova, or New Life. Written in a blend of prose and poetry, the work serves as both a memorial to Beatrice and a meditation on the transformative power of love. In its pages, Dante records the stages of his devotion: the first sight, the joy of her greeting, the anguish of her absence, and the pain of her death. Yet more than a personal diary, the Vita Nuova elevates Beatrice into a symbol. She is no longer just a Florentine woman. She becomes the embodiment of divine love, leading the soul upward toward God. The very title, New Life, reflects how Beatrice gives Dante not only inspiration, but also a sense of renewal, a life reshaped by the vision of love. This conception of love is deeply rooted in the traditions of courtly love, which had flourished in Europe for centuries. Originating in the courts of Provence, the poetry of the troubadours celebrated the ennobling power of devotion to an unattainable lady. Love was portrayed as refining, elevating, and often painful, as the lover suffered in longing and desire. By Dante's time, Italian poets had adapted this tradition into what became known as the dolce stil novo, or sweet new style. These poets, including Guido Cavalcanti, Dante's close friend, infused love poetry with philosophical and spiritual dimensions. They described love as not only passion, but also illumination, a force that purified the soul. Dante inherits this tradition, but transforms it further. For him, Beatrice is not merely a distant object of longing, but a symbol of divine truth. In the Vita Nuova, she is described in angelic terms, a figure who inspires humility and devotion rather than mere desire. This shift marks Dante's innovation. He integrates the personal with the universal, the earthly with the heavenly. Beatrice becomes the bridge between human affection and spiritual salvation. After Beatrice's death, Dante's grief turns inward, but it also deepens his sense of purpose. He writes that he resolves to speak of her no more until he can do so in a way worthy of her exalted status. This vow foreshadows his later work, for it is in the Divine Comedy that Beatrice reappears, no longer as the earthly woman of Florence, but as a celestial guide who leads Dante through the realms of paradise. She becomes, in his vision, the very embodiment of divine wisdom and grace. The impact of Beatrice on Dante's life cannot be overstated. In an age when women were often confined to domestic roles and rarely held a place in literature beyond symbolic figures, Beatrice emerges in Dante's writing as a central force, shaping his spiritual and poetic journey. She is at once real and ideal, historical and symbolic. The layers of meaning surrounding her demonstrate Dante's ability to weave personal experience into a broader philosophical and theological framework. Daily life in Florence reinforces the significance of this vision. The culture of the time celebrates festivals, processions, and religious observances, where beauty and devotion intertwine. For Dante, Beatrice becomes the living image of this union, a person in whom earthly beauty points toward divine truth. Her presence, even in memory, transforms the mundane rhythms of life into occasions for reflection on higher realities. As we imagine Dante in this period, we see him as a young poet, writing verses by candlelight, his thoughts consumed not by politics or wealth, but by the vision of a woman whose brief presence alters the course of his life. His friends, fellow poets of the Stilnovisti, recognize in him a unique depth of feeling, a capacity to transform personal longing into universal insight. Through their exchanges, Dante refines his craft, but it is Beatrice who remains the heart of his inspiration. In reflecting on this chapter, we see how Dante's concept of love is not static but dynamic. It begins as the tender affection of a young boy, grows into the refined devotion of a poet, and matures into the spiritual vision of a man seeking salvation. Beatrice becomes the constant thread through these stages, her presence binding together Dante's inner life and his artistic creation. As you drift toward rest, imagine Dante walking the narrow streets of Florence, passing by Beatrice perhaps only in glimpses, yet carrying her image with him always. She is more than a figure of memory. She is the star by which he steers the course of his poetry and his soul. Through Beatrice, love becomes not a fleeting passion, but an eternal guide, leading Dante and his readers toward the light of truth. In Florence, poetry and love are not the only forces that shape Dante's life. Politics, with its relentless turbulence, plays an equally decisive role. To understand Dante as both man and poet, we must dwell for a time on his civic life, the responsibilities he assumes as a citizen, and the bitter divisions that ultimately lead to his exile. Florence, for all its beauty and vitality, is also a city at war with itself, and Dante becomes both participant and victim of its struggles. The roots of Florence's unrest lie in the long-standing conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs support the authority of the Pope, while the Ghibellines side with the Holy Roman Emperor. These factions are not mere political parties in the modern sense, but deeply entrenched networks of families, guilds, and loyalties. When one side gains the upper hand, the other suffers exile, confiscation of property, and at times execution. In Dante's early years, the Guelphs triumph in Florence, and Dante, whose family aligns with them, grows up in a city under their control. Yet victory does not bring stability. The Guelphs themselves soon fracture into two camps: the White Guelphs, who wish to limit papal influence in Florentine affairs, and the Black Guelphs, who favor the Pope's intervention. Dante, with his independent mind and strong civic sense, aligns with the White Guelphs. His stance reflects both a desire to protect Florence's autonomy and a cautious approach to the excesses of papal power. Dante is not content to remain a passive observer. He enters public life, serving in various civic roles, including as a prior, one of the 6 magistrates governing Florence for a brief term in 1300. As prior, Dante faces delicate choices. Florence at this time teeters on the edge of factional conflict, and Dante participates in decisions intended to preserve order. These decisions include the banishment of leading figures from both white and black Guelph factions in an attempt to cool tensions. It is a strategy meant to balance power, yet it sows seeds of resentment, as those punished return with greater bitterness. Amid this turmoil, Dante is also sent on diplomatic missions, traveling to neighboring cities and courts on behalf of Florence. These journeys expand his perspective, exposing him to broader Italian politics. The Italian peninsula is a mosaic of city-states: Florence, Siena, Bologna, Pisa, and others, each with its own rivalries and ambitions. The papacy, at this time based in Rome, wields spiritual authority but also exerts political pressure, often playing cities against one another. Dante, as an envoy, sees firsthand the delicate dance between autonomy and submission, between civic pride and papal influence. The decisive moment in Dante's political life comes in 1301, when Pope Boniface VIII intervenes directly in Florence. The Black Guelphs, with papal backing, seize control of the city. Dante, away on a mission to Rome at the time, finds himself trapped by circumstance. While he is absent, the new regime condemns him and other white Guelph leaders. He is charged with corruption and fraud, accusations likely motivated more by politics than truth, and sentenced to heavy fines, confiscation of property, and ultimately death should he return. Unable to pay and unwilling to confess to crimes he did not commit, Dante remains in exile. This exile marks a turning point. Dante, once a citizen engaged in the civic life of Florence, becomes a wanderer, dependent on the hospitality of patrons in other cities. The loss is immense. He is cut off from his home, his family, his livelihood, and the city that shaped his identity. Yet exile also deepens his perspective. Stripped of immediate political involvement, he turns inward and upward, transforming his grief into poetry. The Divine Comedy will bear the marks of this experience, for its vision of justice, betrayal, and redemption is grounded in the lived pain of exile. It is striking to observe how Dante interprets politics not only in earthly terms, but also through a spiritual lens. For him, civic corruption is not simply poor governance. It is a reflection of sin, of disordered love and misplaced priorities. In the Inferno, many of the damned are political figures, leaders, popes, and citizens of Florence, condemned for their betrayal of justice and their pursuit of power. In this way, Dante transforms the particular politics of Florence into universal lessons, using the stage of the afterlife to expose the consequences of earthly ambition. Still, we must pause to imagine Dante not only as a poet of exile, but as a citizen deeply involved in civic duty. He attends council meetings, debates policies, listens to petitions from citizens. He walks the streets of Florence, aware of the tension in the air, aware that every decision carries risks. The bells of the Palazzo della Signoria ring out, marking official proclamations. Families whisper in their towers, weighing alliances. The city lives in constant suspense, never certain which faction will prevail. In this atmosphere, Dante grows into a man who values justice, integrity, and the fragile balance of civic life. His role as prior, though brief, is perhaps the most telling moment of his political career. It shows him as someone willing to place the needs of the city above personal gain, willing to take difficult decisions even at personal cost. It also foreshadows his fate. The very attempt to balance factions ensures that both sides will remember him with suspicion. Politics in Florence rarely forgives neutrality or moderation. As we reflect on this chapter of his life, we see how politics both wounds and refines Dante. His exile deprives him of Florence, but it also frees him to write. His bitter encounters with corruption and betrayal give him insight into the nature of justice. His longing for home becomes a metaphor for the soul's longing for heaven. In this way, the political becomes the poetic, and the civic becomes the spiritual. As you drift into rest, picture Dante as a man standing between two worlds. The world of the city, with its factional strife and fragile alliances, and the world of poetry, where he will transform his losses into enduring vision. In the quiet of exile, he carries Florence within him, its beauty, its corruption, its contradictions. And from these materials, he will build a work that transcends politics and time. Exile, for Dante, is not a passing episode, but the defining circumstance of his adult life. From 1302 onward, he lives as a wanderer, never to set foot again in his beloved Florence. This condition of exile is not only physical displacement, but also a profound spiritual trial, one that reshapes his imagination and drives him to create his greatest work. In this section, we follow Dante along the uncertain roads of Italy, tracing the years of wandering, the search for patronage, and the transformation of suffering into art. When the Black Guelph seize control of Florence, Dante is condemned in absentia. His property is confiscated, his reputation stained by charges of corruption, and his family left vulnerable. The sentence declares that, should he return, he will be burned alive. For Dante, the possibility of going home vanishes, replaced by a life of dependency upon the hospitality of others. He joins other exiled white Guelphs, but even among them, divisions persist. Factionalism does not end in exile. Rivalries follow refugees into their new surroundings, and Dante soon distances himself from groups seeking to reclaim Florence by force. He refuses to participate in violent plots, preferring instead the path of writing, reflection, and diplomacy. Dante's wanderings take him across much of northern and central Italy. He is believed to have stayed in Verona under the protection of the Scaliger family, in Bologna with its vibrant intellectual community, and in Lucca, where political intrigue continues to swirl. He likely travels through Forlì, Treviso, and perhaps even as far as Paris, though historical certainty is elusive. Exile in the medieval world is marked by instability. No permanent residence, no secure livelihood, always dependent on shifting alliances and the goodwill of patrons. For Dante, this instability becomes both a burden and a source of perspective. In Verona, he finds a sympathetic environment. The court of Bartolomeo della Scala offers him shelter, and later his successor, Cangrande della Scala, will become one of Dante's most important patrons. It is to Cangrande that Dante dedicates the Paradiso, the third canticle of the Divine Comedy. In these courts, Dante not only survives, but also engages with intellectual circles, continuing his studies in philosophy and theology. These exchanges enrich his work, allowing him to integrate the currents of scholastic thought into the architecture of his poem. Exile, however, also brings hardship. Dante himself reflects upon the bitterness of being a guest in another's house, of eating bread baked by others, of climbing unfamiliar staircases. The lines in Paradiso where he laments the harshness of exile are drawn from lived experience. He knows the humiliation of dependency, the loneliness of separation, the longing for the familiar streets of Florence. Yet he also knows the broadening of horizons, the chance to see Italy as a whole, to reflect upon its fragmentation and corruption, and to imagine a unity that transcends petty rivalries. It is during these years that Dante's literary output deepens. He begins works such as the Convivio, the Banquet, an unfinished collection of philosophical treatises intended to educate readers in the moral and intellectual virtues. Written in the vernacular, it continues his project of making learning accessible. He also writes De Monarchia, a Latin treatise arguing for the necessity of a universal empire independent of papal authority. In this work, Dante expresses his conviction that peace and justice require a political order beyond the chaos of city-states and factions. Though controversial, this vision reflects his longing for stability and justice in a world torn by conflict. Yet above all, Exile provides the conditions for the creation of the Divine Comedy. Removed from Florence, Dante has the distance to transform his personal pain into universal narrative. He envisions himself as a pilgrim wandering through realms of the afterlife, guided by reason in the form of Virgil, and later by divine love in the form of Beatrice. The structure of the poem, journeying from darkness to light, from exile to homecoming, mirrors his own condition. His personal exile becomes an allegory for the soul's exile from God, and the longing for Florence becomes transmuted into the longing for paradise. Daily life in exile is simple, often austere. Dante lives in borrowed rooms, travels along dusty roads, and writes by candlelight. He relies on the charity of patrons, but also earns respect through his poetry and reputation as a thinker. His presence in courts is not that of a mere supplicant, but of a respected intellectual, one whose insights and verses bring honor to his hosts. Still, the ache of displacement never leaves him. His letters express bitterness toward Florence, mingled with yearning for reconciliation. He dreams of return, but never achieves it. The pain of exile also sharpens his sense of justice. Those who condemned him appear in his poetry, placed in the circles of hell according to their sins. Yet Dante's condemnation is not mere revenge. It is framed within a cosmic order where each soul's punishment reflects its choices. In this way, Dante transforms his personal enemies into exemplars of universal truths. Exile becomes not only a personal burden, but also a lens through which to interpret human failings and divine justice. As we reflect on these wandering years, we see how exile, though bitter, becomes fertile ground. It strips Dante of comfort, but grants him vision. It separates him from Florence, but connects him to Italy as a whole. It forces him to relinquish worldly power, but gives him the freedom to create a work that transcends politics and speaks to the human condition. Imagine Dante on a quiet night in exile, seated at a wooden desk in a borrowed room, quill in hand. Outside, the streets of a foreign city are hushed, the air heavy with the scent of smoke from nearby hearths. Within, he bends over parchment, his thoughts weaving together memory, philosophy, and vision. The exile, once a wound, becomes the wellspring of a poem that will endure across centuries. As you rest, hold this image. Dante the Wanderer, finding in loss the seed of immortality, transforming the bitterness of exile into the sweetness of eternal poetry. Exile brings Dante sorrow, but it also grants him the solitude and focus necessary to begin shaping the work that will define his legacy, the Divine Comedy. This monumental poem is both intensely personal and expansively universal, weaving together theology, philosophy, history, and imagination into a vast journey of the soul. In this section, we will trace the years in which Dante conceives and composes his masterpiece, exploring its structure, purpose, and the conditions that allowed it to take form. Dante likely begins writing the Divine Comedy around 1308 during his years of exile. By this time, he has already completed earlier works such as the Vita Nuova and fragments of the Convivio. These earlier writings reveal his preoccupation with love, philosophy, and the vernacular language, but in the comedy, he unites them into a single, sweeping vision. His exile provides not only the emotional impetus, his sense of loss and longing, but also the distance from daily politics needed to reflect upon the broader condition of humanity. The structure of the comedy is meticulously ordered. It is divided into 3 canticles: Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio, Purgatory, and Paradiso, Paradise, each composed of 33 cantos, except Inferno, which has 34, making 100 in total. This perfect round number reflects medieval ideals of harmony and completion. The poem is written in terza rima, a rhyme scheme Dante himself invents, consisting of interlocking tercets, Eba, BCB, CDC. The effect is one of continuity and flow, as though each verse leads inexorably into the next. This form becomes Dante's signature, marrying structure to substance. Equally striking is Dante's choice of language. Rather than writing in Latin, the language of scholarship, he chooses the Tuscan vernacular. This decision democratizes learning, making his vision accessible to readers outside clerical and academic circles. In doing so, he elevates Italian into a literary language, setting the stage for its eventual adoption as the basis of modern Italian. The comedy thus becomes not only a spiritual and literary journey, but also a cultural milestone. The purpose of the poem, as Dante himself states, is to lead readers from a state of misery to a state of happiness. It is at once a story of one man's journey and a guide for all humanity. The protagonist is Dante himself, who begins lost in a dark wood, a symbol of sin and confusion, and then embarks on a journey through the afterlife. Along the way, he encounters figures from myth, history, and his own time, each placed in the afterlife according to their deeds. The poem becomes a mirror of human life, showing the consequences of sin, the hope of redemption, and the promise of eternal union with God. Writing the comedy is no simple task. Dante labors for years, revising, refining, and expanding. He composes in exile, often dependent on patrons who provide him shelter and support. His wanderings across Italy bring him into contact with different intellectual circles, enriching his vision with insights from theology, philosophy, and politics. The poem thus reflects not only his personal imagination, but also the collective currents of medieval thought. Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Virgil all echo in his verses. Dante is also meticulous in his numerology. The entire poem is structured around the number 3, symbolizing the Trinity. 3 canticles, 33 cantos each, tercettes of 3 lines. Even the punishments and rewards described in the poem often follow patterns of 3s and 9s. For Dante, numbers are not arbitrary but sacred, reflecting the order of the cosmos itself. To read the comedy is to glimpse a universe infused with divine proportion. The conditions of exile, harsh as they are, shape the poem in decisive ways. Dante's bitterness toward Florence and its leaders appears in his depictions of sinners in hell. Political figures he once knew are placed among the damned, their fates reflecting their corruption. Yet his longing for justice extends beyond personal grievances. He imagines an ordered cosmos where every soul receives its due, where sin leads to punishment, virtue to reward, and repentance to purification. In this sense, the comedy becomes not only a personal reckoning, but also a universal vision of justice. At the same time, the poem is suffused with love. Beatrice reappears as the radiant guide who leads Dante through paradise, symbolizing divine grace. Her presence embodies the belief that love elevates the soul and unites it with God. This blend of justice and love, of stern order and tender mercy, gives the comedy its unique power. It is not merely a catalog of punishments and rewards, but a meditation on the deepest questions of human existence. Why are we here? What is our destiny? How does one live a meaningful life? We should also imagine the process of composition itself. Dante writes by hand on parchment, using ink made from oak galls. He drafts and revises, testing the flow of terza rima, ensuring the clarity of allegory. By candlelight or daylight, in borrowed rooms or in the courts of patrons, he labors steadily, carrying the vision of the comedy within him. The act of writing becomes, in itself, a pilgrimage, a movement from exile to transcendence. By the time of his death in 1321, Dante has completed the Divine Comedy. Copies circulate among scholars and readers, spreading his vision across Italy and beyond. The poem quickly earns recognition as a masterpiece, though its complexity ensures that interpretation continues for centuries. It becomes a touchstone for theology, philosophy, art, and literature, shaping the imaginations of generations to come. As we rest in this stage of the story, let us reflect on how creation often arises from loss. Exile, though bitter, grants Dante the solitude to write. Pain, though sharp, fuels his vision of redemption. In this way, the comedy becomes not only a record of the afterlife, but also a testament to the human capacity to transform suffering into beauty. Imagine Dante, nearing the end of a day's writing, setting aside his pen and gazing into the distance. Around him lies the uncertainty of exile, but within his heart burns the certainty of a vision that transcends his circumstances. He writes not for his patrons, not for his enemies, not even for Florence, but for all humanity. For us, who centuries later still read his words by lamplight or hear them whispered in the quiet of night. We now step into the dark and vivid landscapes of Inferno, the first canticle of the Divine Comedy. In these passages, Dante's imagination takes on its most dramatic form, constructing a vision of hell that is at once orderly, terrifying, and deeply symbolic. Though written in exile, this journey through circles of the damned becomes one of the most enduring depictions of sin and justice in Western literature. Let us wander gently through its structure, themes, and imagery, pausing along the way to reflect on the lessons it imparts. The journey begins in a dark wood, where Dante the pilgrim, representing humanity, finds himself lost, afraid, and unable to find the straight path. This image of confusion and disorientation symbolizes the condition of sin when one is separated from divine guidance. At this moment, the ancient Roman poet Virgil appears as a guide, sent by Beatrice. Virgil represents human reason, capable of leading Dante through the realms of hell and purgatory, though not into paradise, where divine love alone can ascend. Thus, from the very beginning, the Inferno presents itself as a journey guided by both reason and faith. Hell itself is depicted as a vast funnel-shaped pit, descending in concentric circles toward the Earth's center. Each circle contains souls punished for particular sins, with the severity increasing as one moves deeper. The structure reflects the medieval belief that sin is not chaotic but ordered, each fault corresponding to its rightful punishment. This principle is known as contrapasso, or counter-suffering, in which the punishment mirrors the sin. For example, the lustful are swept eternally in a storm, as they once allowed themselves to be carried away by passion. The flatterers wade through filth as their false words soiled others. The first circles are reserved for less grievous sins. In limbo, the first circle, reside the virtuous pagans, figures such as Homer, Socrates, and Virgil himself, who lived before Christianity or outside its grace. They are not tormented, but remain forever deprived of the vision of God. This placement reflects Dante's respect for classical wisdom while also affirming Christian doctrine. As Dante and Virgil descend, the punishments become more severe. Gluttons lie in mire, pelted by ceaseless rain. The greedy and the wasteful push heavy weights against one another in endless futility. These images are vivid yet restrained, not intended to shock, but to instruct. Each scene offers a meditation on the consequences of disordered desire. In the middle circles, Dante encounters sins of violence, fraud, and treachery. Here appear many of his contemporaries, Florentine leaders, corrupt popes, notorious tyrants, condemned for their actions. This intertwining of personal experience with universal allegory gives the Inferno both immediacy and timelessness. To medieval readers, these figures were familiar, their placement in hell a bold act of moral judgment. For modern readers, they serve as reminders that corruption, greed, and betrayal are not confined to one era. Among the most famous episodes is the encounter with Francesca da Rimini, who tells the story of her adulterous love with Paolo. Swept together by desire, they now whirl forever in the tempest of the lustful. Francesca's words are tender, her sorrow palpable, and Dante himself is moved to tears. Yet Virgil reminds him that pity for the damned risks misunderstanding the justice of God. Here, the poem balances compassion with moral clarity, acknowledging human weakness while affirming eternal order. As Dante and Virgil descend further, the landscape becomes more desolate. Rivers of boiling blood, forests of twisted trees inhabited by suicides, fiery rain falling upon blasphemers, all paint a world both symbolic and stark. These images are not meant to horrify, but to reflect spiritual truths. The violence of the sinners becomes mirrored in their surroundings. The suicides who destroyed their own bodies are now transformed into barren trees, denied the human form they once abandoned. The final circles of hell are reserved for fraud and treachery, the sins Dante regards as most destructive because they undermine trust, the foundation of human community. Here, flatterers, hypocrites, thieves, and deceivers suffer torments corresponding to their deceptions. At the very bottom lies Cocytus, a frozen lake where traitors are imprisoned in ice. The imagery of ice, rather than fire, conveys the coldness of betrayal, the absolute absence of love. At the center of hell resides Lucifer, the fallen angel, vast and grotesque, chewing eternally on Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius, the betrayers of Christ and Caesar. This vision crystallizes Dante's theme. Betrayal of the highest trust is the gravest sin. Hell ends not in flames, but in chilling stillness, a place devoid of light, warmth, and hope. Yet even here, in the darkest depths, the journey does not end. Virgil and Dante climb upward, emerging on the other side of the earth, where the mountain of Purgatory rises. This transition reminds us that the purpose of the comedy is not despair, but ascent. Inferno is not an end in itself, but a stage on the path toward purification and ultimately paradise. The lessons of Inferno are clear yet gentle in their delivery. Sin, Dante teaches, leads to isolation, futility, and suffering. Yet the vision of hell is not intended merely to condemn, but to awaken readers to reflection. Each soul encountered serves as a mirror, inviting us to consider our own choices and their consequences. As you drift into quietude, imagine the slow descent through Dante's circles, not as a terrifying plunge, but as a contemplative walk through the consequences of human failings. The voices of the damned echo faintly, reminding us of the importance of order, justice, and love. At the journey's end, we glimpse the possibility of turning upward, away from darkness, toward renewal. From the frozen stillness of hell, Dante and Virgil emerge to behold something entirely new, the vast mountain of Purgatory. Unlike Inferno, which is filled with despair, Purgatorio is infused with hope. Here, the souls of the faithful are not damned, but purified, ascending slowly toward the light of heaven. This canticle offers a gentler vision, where suffering has purpose and where progress is possible. To walk with Dante through Purgatory is to reflect on renewal, transformation, and the slow work of grace. The mountain of Purgatory rises on the far side of the world, opposite Jerusalem, created from the displaced earth when Lucifer fell from heaven. Its placement emphasizes balance. If hell is a pit that descends inward, Purgatory is a mountain that rises upward. The souls who climb it are not condemned forever, but are on pilgrimage, undergoing purification before entering paradise. At the base of the mountain, Dante and Virgil encounter the late repentant, souls who delayed turning to God until the final moment of life. Their progress is slower, but still, they wait in hope, their eyes turned upward. This beginning sets the tone. Purgatory is a realm of patience, of waiting, of gradual transformation. The mountain itself is divided into terraces, each devoted to a particular sin. Unlike the circles of hell, where punishment is eternal, the purgatorial terraces are stages of healing. On each level, souls undergo a discipline that directly counters their fault, slowly learning to realign their loves. For example, the proud, who once exalted themselves, are bent under heavy stones, learning humility through the posture of burden. The envious, who once looked with malice upon others, now have their eyes sewn shut, teaching them to turn inward and upward instead of outward in jealousy. The wrathful, consumed by anger, now walk in clouds of smoke, deprived of clear sight until they learn gentleness. This principle of purgation reflects the medieval understanding of sin as a distortion of love. In Purgatory, love is not destroyed but healed, redirected toward its proper object. Each discipline is painful, but it is embraced willingly by the souls, who know that their suffering leads to freedom. Unlike hell, where souls resist and deny responsibility, here the penitents accept their purification with gratitude. Their songs echo with psalms and prayers, and their faces shine with anticipation. Dante's tone in Purgatorio is markedly different from the harshness of Inferno. The air is clearer, the light brighter, the mood more hopeful. The mountain is filled with hymns, voices raised in harmony. Angels appear, guiding the souls upward, their wings scattering light. Each encounter becomes not merely a warning, but an encouragement, showing how human failings can be transformed. Throughout this ascent, Dante reflects on the nature of free will. Unlike in hell, where choices are fixed, here souls exercise freedom to cooperate with grace. The mountain thus becomes a school of virtue, where lessons are learned slowly but surely. Dante himself learns alongside them, recognizing the need for humility, patience, and perseverance. A pivotal moment occurs when Virgil, who represents human reason, acknowledges his limits. As they approach the summit of the mountain, Virgil tells Dante that he can guide him no further. Human reason, though noble and essential, cannot lead to ultimate union with God. For that, divine love is necessary. At this moment, Beatrice reappears, radiant and transformed, to guide Dante into paradise. Her presence marks the transition from human wisdom to divine grace, from reason to revelation. The imagery of Purgatorio often draws upon natural beauty. Sunlight floods the terraces, flowers bloom along paths, stars glimmer above, the souls sing in harmony, and the mountain itself feels alive with motion upward. These details contrast sharply with the darkness of hell, underscoring the poem's message. The journey of the soul is not only a release from sin, but also an ascent into beauty. For medieval readers, the idea of purgatory held deep significance. It reflected the belief that even after death, the soul could be purified, that God's mercy extended beyond the grave. Families prayed for the departed, offering masses and intercessions to aid their progress. Dante's vision gives this doctrine a vivid landscape, allowing readers to imagine the stages of purification as a real, tangible journey. As we reflect on this canticle, we see how Dante offers not despair, but encouragement. Every soul here is on the way to heaven. Every burden borne is temporary. Every step upward brings greater light. Purgatory is not merely a place of waiting. It is a place of becoming, where the soul is reshaped in love. Imagine, as you drift into rest, the sound of hymns rising up the terraces, the sight of souls climbing steadily toward the summit, the glow of dawn breaking over the mountain. The air is clear, the path upward open, and hope fills the heart. Dante's vision reminds us that transformation is always possible, that even in our failings, renewal awaits. At last, we rise with Dante into the luminous realms of Paradiso, the final canticle of the Divine Comedy. If Inferno showed the consequences of sin and Purgatorio revealed the hope of renewal, then Paradiso unfolds the ultimate fulfillment, the soul's union with the divine. In this final vision, Dante explores the mysteries of love, wisdom, and eternity, drawing together the threads of his journey into one radiant tapestry. The ascent begins with Beatrice as guide. She is no longer the youthful Florentine whom Dante glimpsed in childhood, nor simply the object of courtly devotion, but a figure transfigured by divine light. She embodies grace itself, leading Dante upward through the celestial spheres. Each sphere corresponds to a virtue, a step closer to perfection, reflecting the medieval cosmology inherited from Aristotle and Christian theology. The souls encountered here are radiant, not tormented or burdened. In the sphere of the moon, Dante meets those who broke vows but remained faithful in intent. In Mercury, he sees souls who pursued honor and achievement. Venus holds the lovers, the Sun the wise theologians, Mars the warriors of faith, Jupiter the just rulers, and Saturn the contemplatives. Beyond the spheres of the planets lie the stars, and beyond them, the crystalline heavens. Each level represents a higher perfection, but all share one truth: joy. The souls shine with the love of God, their being fully aligned with divine will. Dante is often overwhelmed by the radiance. His language falters as he tries to describe the brilliance of the blessed. He frequently pauses to remind readers that his words can only approximate the vision, that the true glory of paradise surpasses human expression. This humility is part of the poem's charm. It invites us not to grasp every detail, but to rest in wonder. Throughout Paradiso, philosophy and theology intertwine. Dante converses with saints such as Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, who expound on wisdom and harmony. He learns of divine justice, the mystery of predestination, and the order of the cosmos. Yet these teachings are not abstract. They are sung, danced, and embodied in the movements of the blessed. Knowledge here is not cold but radiant, infused with love. Dante portrays the highest wisdom as inseparable from joy, suggesting that truth and happiness are one. The culmination comes in the Empyrean, the realm beyond space and time, where Dante beholds the white rose of the blessed. Thousands of souls sit in tiers of light, like petals unfolding toward the center, where God shines in eternal brilliance. Angels move like bees among the petals, carrying the grace of divine love. Beatrice, having led Dante to this vision, now returns to her place among the blessed. In her stead, Saint Bernard guides Dante in the final steps of contemplation. The poem reaches its climax when Dante gazes directly upon the divine mystery. He sees circles of light representing the Trinity, equal yet distinct, each reflecting the other. In one circle, he perceives the image of Christ in human form. At this moment, Dante experiences an overwhelming union of intellect and desire, where his will aligns perfectly with the divine will. He describes this vision with words that are both simple and profound: the love that moves the sun and the other stars. It is a statement that encapsulates the entire poem. Love is the force that governs the cosmos, the principle that guides creation, justice, and salvation. This final vision also reflects Dante's personal journey, from the exile wandering foreign roads, stripped of home and power, to the poet who imagines himself standing before God. The arc is one of redemption. His personal pain becomes a universal allegory, his longing for Florence transformed into longing for paradise. In this way, the Divine Comedy becomes not only a story of the afterlife, but also a meditation on the human condition, on the soul's restless search for fulfillment. The legacy of Dante and his comedy is immense. Within a century of its completion, it was read and studied across Europe. Artists illustrated its scenes, theologians debated its theology, poets imitated its style. Its use of vernacular Italian helped shape the language itself, giving Italy a literary foundation comparable to what Chaucer's Canterbury Tales did for English. In the centuries that followed, figures such as Boccaccio, Petrarch, and later even T.S. Eliot found inspiration in Dante's vision. Painters such as Botticelli and Gustave Doré created images that carried Dante's landscapes into visual art. His work influenced not only literature, but also theology, philosophy, and the broader cultural imagination. Dante himself died in 1321 in Ravenna, far from Florence. He never returned to his city in life, though centuries later, Florence formally rescinded his exile and honored him as its greatest poet. His tomb in Ravenna remains a place of pilgrimage, a reminder of the exile who created a home for all humanity in his poetry. Florence, too, built an empty tomb in the Basilica of Santa Croce, a symbolic gesture of welcome long after his death. As we reflect on Dante's legacy, we recognize how his work continues to resonate. The questions he raises about justice, love, destiny, and hope are as pressing today as they were in the 14th century. His vision of a universe governed by love invites readers to consider not only the afterlife, but also the way we live in this world. And so, as this long journey draws to a close, imagine the final image Dante leaves us with: the universe itself moved by love, every star and sun guided by a force beyond measure, a force that is also tender and near. For Dante, this is the truth revealed at the end of his pilgrimage, the truth he offers to us in quiet words across the centuries. As you drift now into rest, let these images linger: the white rose unfolding in eternal light, the stars glimmering in harmony, and the poet himself resting at last in vision of love. His journey through Florence, exile, poetry, hell, purgatory, and paradise is complete, and so too is ours.